tight security and do a really good job, they're placed alongside with some company that might have just paid $25,000 to be assured by some sort of agency that does assurances and says this is a good certificate authority. And so we needed to show this, we felt, so that people would be able to understand that this attack was not theoretical. It wasn't an academic ivory tower discussion. It's very real. And there are interesting discussions to be had about how certificate authorities get inserted into different operating systems and browsers, which isn't necessarily for here. But you should look at them and question them.
All right, so finally, we'd like to thank a few people. We've worked very closely with the EFF on this, particularly Jennifer Granick and Joe Gratz, who is actually here in the audience. They were very helpful with various legal issues surrounding this research. We also had lawyers from all the other organizations, CWI, TU Eindhoven, and EPFL. Sometimes coordinating between all of those was pretty complicated, but we managed to do it. We also got some help from Dan Kaminsky, who graciously assisted me with collecting SSL certificates. He had done a lot of that before when he was working on his DNS bug. Also, Ralph Philipp Weinman for actually inspiring this research by sending an email to Jake and David, I believe pointing out that the certificate was using MD5, or Jake can probably tell the story.
Essentially, there was an IRC conversation that we had, which is like where the birth of all great ideas come from, right? So we had this conversation, and it occurred to David and I that this is something that we should look into. And really, if it wasn't for Ralph, I don't think that I would even be interested in cryptography at all. So he's really like the most awesome guy in the world, and you should all shower him with praise. He's the tall, dark, handsome guy in the middle. So we'd also like to thank Len Sassaman and Meredith Patterson, who are just badass cypherpunks and in general really, really awesome. We really respect them a great deal. And they have also talked with us about this, and this is something that is quite interesting to them as well. Microsoft was incredibly interesting to work with. So we did something different for this talk. We were concerned about possible legal ramifications of pulling this attack off. And we were very secretive about it up front because the biggest risk that we felt was the risk of being gagged for being a security researcher, trying to tell the world about something that might undermine the bottom line of a corporation. Yeah, good sentence there. So what we did was we asked Microsoft and Mozilla to sign non-disclosure agreements. See, generally it's the researcher that has this fear, legal fear, about talking to people. And what we wanted to do was make sure that Microsoft and Mozilla and anyone else involved did not leak this to the certificate authority who might try to gag us if they knew who we were. So we turned that on its head. And we hope that other security researchers will also do this. And they will protect themselves in a way where other companies will want to know about these things, and they will be treated with respect and dignity in both directions. And so that the researchers don't have to fear when they're coming forward to actually make things better, when they're trying to improve the security of things, when they're trying to essentially be, a whistleblower for things that are just egregiously wrong in the processes that are in place on the internet. And Microsoft took a little bit of time to come around, but they did, and they were really quite gracious about it. And Mozilla signed up immediately. They were fabulous to deal with. And it was really quite nice to work with vendors where they were sort of a little bit in awe, and they were kind of unsure what to do next. And they'll probably both issue patches. We're not actually sure what patches or what they're going to do. They haven't necessarily told us anything other than possibly blacklisting our certificate. But that's something that I think is worth everyone here who does any sort of research consider that this is something that you might want to do if you feel that it's necessary. Obviously, it's not a good idea to just flood companies with non-disclosure requests because that will completely undermine this process. But if you really are afraid that you might be targeted for legal action, you can ask them to have a sort of a mutual leap of faith, I guess. So that's something worthwhile. And yeah, oh, and also the New World Order, apparently.
Government. Yeah. Lastly, we have the SNF and the NWO. That's are respectively the Swiss and the Dutch government funding for the academic research. So I have to mention.
So hopefully now you guys will have some questions, and also I'm going to make sure that the wireless live man in the middle demo thing here will actually work now that I don't have to use that as my terminal, which is really fabulous. So if you guys or gals have any questions, we would love to answer them for you now. So feel free to line up the microphones and we will answer your questions.
Hi. Do you have a complete list somewhere of CAs that are using MD5? Should we choose to want to remove them from our browsers and everything else, and then be left with manually giving exceptions to leaf if we actually trust that website?
So this is in our paper, but this is, as I said, complicated. For example, some of the very root certificate authorities signed themselves with MD5, but no longer issue with MD5. And there's an important distinction to be made there, because what that means for you is that you see an MD5 signature in the chain of trust, but it isn't the last one, and it might be the first one, it might be the second one, and it may be legitimate, it may not be legitimate. And if and when someone has second pre-image attacks, that becomes an even worse problem. But again, disabling them takes a good swath of the value out of any SSL at all.
Also, you have to keep in mind that if you remove the rapid SSL root, for example, this will break, according to the collection of certs that we got, this will break about 30% of the secure websites on the internet, which is a pretty significant number. So perhaps removing them outright is not the best option for everybody.
Sorry, I have a question. Any of the code signing certificates in the Windows operating system signed with MD5?
We haven't really looked into that. So, I don't know.
I have another question. Have these vendors in any way excluded commercial liability for the certificates they provide, especially since this attack has been known since 2007? In other words, given that you don't know that this is happening, or you have no definitive proof, you saw the lock and you were doing your electronic banking and money disappeared. Have these banks now somebody to sue? Can they sue their certificate providers for signing with MD5 even though they knew? In other words, you were saying we don't know when they're going to upgrade. How true is that?
Well, we're not lawyers ourselves, so we can't really comment on any legal issues. Just based on my practical experience, I'm pretty sure that all of these certificate authorities have wording somewhere that says we're not responsible for anything. All of those big EULAs that you click through without even reading usually say that. The demo URL? Yes. It's i.broke.theinternet, or it has dots between every word. So it's I broke the internet and all I got was this t-shirt.
Okay, so my question is, should we treat all CA public keys with an obvious padding, such as the comment block, as suspect? Or would this be a way to detect if anyone pulled off the stunt before?
Well, this will detect. Okay, so there are two certificates. There is the legitimate one that you send to the CA, which the CA might keep a copy of, and then there's the rogue one. You're not going to see nobody will see the rogue one until it's used, and it might be used only against a. You want to answer that? Okay. Oh. Okay, I was confused about what's going on. Nobody will see the rogue certificate until it's used against them. So it could be a very targeted attack. If you do see a certificate with a long Netscape comment field that has a bunch of random looking data in it, yeah, that is suspicious. However, there are many other fields that an attacker can use. This is just what we chose for our proof of concept. Somebody else can just construct their certificate in a slightly different way. So it's hard to tell. It's hard to tell whether you're being attacked using this method. Also, if the attackers only do if they only do the attack where they get a collision for a website, so they don't have a rogue CA, they just have a rogue website certificate, then the only difference is going to be in the name of the site. And the collision bits are going to be hidden in the RSA key, which looks random anyways. So it's not going to be possible to really tell if it's been part of this attack or not. So yes, our certificate you can probably detect just by looking at it very carefully. But you can certainly do the attack in other ways that are much harder to detect.
Well, one thing that I've toyed with a little bit, though it certainly isn't perfect, is the idea of creating, free software that would allow you to have some sort of alternate trust metric. Like, for example, in the past we've looked at other ways of evaluating whether a certificate is actually valid by looking from different points on the internet. This is an experimental project that's called Perspectives. And essentially, well, we don't necessarily make a recommendation of this. The idea itself is very appealing to me, which is that perhaps the signature is of a particular weight, and perhaps the fact that you can see it from 80 places on the internet is also of a particular weight. And perhaps because you also trust that certificate authority, it's very useful. But the way that we do it, Matt Blaze has a great quote. He says, basically, commercial security companies only protect you against people who they won't take money from. So if you think about what that means, I'm butchering the quote there, but if you think about what that means, commercial certificate authorities, even if they do switch to SHA-1, that doesn't mean that they're perfect. And it doesn't mean that you've found all of the CA roots on your machine, because your web browser might use one and your IRC client might use another. And so it's worth considering that it's a very complex issue as to how CA certs end up on your computer and why you end up trusting them. And even like the concept of security based on X5 unknown signatures is questionable to some extent. So this is the URL where you can read about all of the technical things that we're releasing right now, as well as the proofs, the certificates, and so forth. And it also links to some other documents, so they're worth reading. Any other questions? You, Mr. WikiLeaks.
Wait. Thank you for this great talk. If the certificate has already been cached by a browser or accessed by a browser, and the certificate chain changes, which is what is happening in your attack, and would also happen for rogue CAs, not of your type, but the regular commercial ones, which are all around, will any of the browsers report the change in the certificate change?
So the short answer is no. Implementation detail here is that I wrote basically some modifications to a tool that a friend of mine wrote, SSL Sniff, and one of the issues was that the tool was originally used for exploiting basic constraints vulnerabilities in Microsoft Internet Explorer. A couple of years back, they didn't respect that, so you could easily do this. And I had some trouble with the man-in-the-middle tool at first because Firefox cares about the serial number when you have like serial numbers of different certificates. But it turns out if you just generate a random serial number that the browser has never seen before, then the browser accepts it as the new certificate, and it doesn't care about it at all. And so for practical exploitation, that means that if you can't tell that the certificate is invalid from another way, that serial number is not a protection. And that's not, it wasn't designed as a protection either. It's just maybe even a bug in Firefox, because Opera, for example, doesn't care, Internet Explorer doesn't care, none of the IRC or mail clients that we tested cared at all.
I think that if somebody has such a certificate which uses MD5, do you advise to exchange it immediately?